And then we think about this, old people need specialists as much as anything else. A 30-year-old probably needs to see his doctor once every 5 years and he's probably fine.
자, 본격적으로 오늘 버니 씨가 소개해 주실 미국 주식 알아보도록 할 텐데요. 오늘의 종목은 헬스케어 관련 종목이라고 합니다. 게다가 정말 이 국내 서학개미 분들은 알지 못하는 이 스몰캡 종목이라고 하는데 이 종목에 대한 소개 바로 부탁드릴게요.
The stock I'd like to talk to today is AMN. AMN recruits and staffs doctors, whether they be physicians or specialists, nurses, and other healthcare professionals for the healthcare industry. AMN is the largest managed service provider in the healthcare industry, and it's the highest ranked managed service provider in the healthcare industry. In addition to recruiting and placing doctors and nurses and healthcare people, it also has other practices where it designs staffing for nurses and other operations people. It also manages vendor relationships, and it also provides for a systematic implementation of a staffing system. So we can, in essence, cut costs and become more efficient. Okay, so that's AMN. So if we take a look at the AMN stock right here, we can see over the last 4 years that the stock has done fairly well. It had a little bit of a decline going into COVID, and coming out of COVID, it really outperformed. If we look at the revenues from AMN, we can see that the revenues outperformed both the healthcare industry and the market as a whole, if we look at the returns. So the returns are extremely positive for the last year. The stock is a significant performer, and the healthcare sector in and of itself is not really keeping up with the overall market as a whole, but that's understandable. It's an industry that doesn't always outperform. I think the outlook is that this stock is pretty much in a recession-proof business. And the reason I say that is there's an acute shortage of doctors. There's an acute shortage of physicians. There's an acute shortage of specialists. There's an acute shortage of nurses, and there's acute shortage of healthcare professionals. For every hire, there's probably 2 job openings. We are right now in all-time highs in terms of vacancies, and we are in all-time highs in terms of job quits. In addition, AMN acquired a company about 1.5 years ago called Stratus Video. And what Stratus Video does is it provides remote interpreter services for patients. So in the United States, there's patients that speak Korean, there's patients that speak Spanish, there's patients that speak French and German and all that, and there's patients that need sign language help. Well, this is a device that goes in with the patient, and it provides feedback through an interpreter for the patient to understand what's going on, what the physician says, or what the surgeon is saying, or what the nurse is saying. And it's a good alternative. It's a cost-effective alternative to providing on-site interpretation staff. So the other thing we need to think about with this is that of the hospital budget, 50% of the hospital budget is geared towards providing for the workforce, supporting the workforce. And then of that workforce, 50% of that workforce supports the nursing staff. So it's so important to manage our costs. And we go back to the services that AMN provides in terms of providing staffing models and recommendations on finding staff people for that nursing and the healthcare professional staff. There are two drivers that drive this business more than anything else currently. And one is the aging of our US population. If you call us part of the baby boomers are people that were born between 1947 and about 1970. And we are, 1957 is the peak birth rate of that whole period. And what we're experiencing right now is 10,000 people a day in the United States are turning 65. So our population is building up a large base of an aging people. It's not that we're aging as a whole, but the population base that's going into the seniors is growing pretty substantially right now. And then if you think about this also, if you think about doctors, okay, we can take physicians and we can take specialists. Specialists are more surgeons. These physicians tend to be younger than the specialists. The specialists tend to be older. Those older specialists are also getting into retirement age. So there's more of a need for those specialists. And then we think about this, old people need specialists as much as anything else. A 30-year-old probably needs to see his doctor once every 5 years and he's probably fine. You know, a 70-year-old needs to see his doctor quite frequently. Finally, the model in the US for physicians is changing a little bit. For the whole period of time that we've basically been a country, the model that we have is that the physician generates his own practice. So the physician generates his own practice. He goes and finds his own patients. He pays for his own equipment, and he's responsible for all that. So he is where his patients are. About 10 years ago, we started this employed doctor practice where medical groups, hospitals, healthcare units hired doctors themselves. They provided the patients for the doctors, and they provided the medical equipment for the doctors. The doctors basically worked out of the hospital or the medical group. Well, if a doctor is a patient where he's got his own patients, he really can't move. If somebody wants to hire an employed doctor to another practice, they can do that because they have the patients. So that provides more latitude for the doctors that are employed to be able to move. Hence, AMN has more of a revenue base to work for because that's another aspect that they can provide.
네, AMN 헬스케어 서비스가 정말 이 수요와 공급을 딱 알맞게 연결시켜주는 그런 기업이라는 생각이 드는데, 의사도 그렇고 환자도 그렇고 서로에게 좀 윈윈할 수 있는 그런 서비스를 제공하는 것이라는 생각이 듭니다. 게다가 이 불황에 대한 영향도 받지 않을 것이라고 하니까 업계에 대한 전망도 매우 좋아 보이는데, 그렇다면 이 AMN 서비스에 대한 주요 고객층은 어떤 고객일지 좀 궁금한데요. 어느 곳일까요?
So hospitals wind up, if we think about this, doctors can also be temporary on top of being hired on a permanent basis. And of the hospitals, 85% of all the hospitals, medical groups, and healthcare facilities have wound up hiring temporary doctors. Now, if we break that down and just look at the hospitals alone, 100% of the hospitals in the United States have hired temporary doctors. So that's a tremendous place for them to be able to generate revenues. Then the other thing is that the company has a national search firm subsidiary that recruits and searches out and hires doctors, physicians, and nurses. On top of that, they also do consulting for the medical groups in the hospitals, and they provide a recruitment service for nurses and other physicians' assistants. So we talked about before how the stock really got hurt at the onset of COVID. And let's think about the reasons for some of that, okay? I think that doctors had problems traveling. I also believe that we were in lockdown, so people couldn't travel at all to go see their doctor if it was not an emergency. And we also basically put a halt on elective surgeries. And elective surgeries can be anything from plastic surgery to dermatology to even some cancer surgeries were viewed as an elective. So the specialists were basically out of business for a period of time. And the market really reacted by depressing that stock fairly substantially. But the demographics overwhelmed the temporary situation because we keep growing our aging population. We keep having an acute need for doctors. And so what happened is we recovered out of that bounce, as we saw in that chart previous. And it was a fairly significant move that we've had off of the March-April low of 2020 into the current prices that we have right now. So if we also think about the stock, I think that the stock over the course of the last year and a half is probably back on pace to where it needs to go. So it had the big decline and then it had the rally.
네, 아무래도 코로나19 팬데믹이 발발하기 전과 후가 상황이 좀 많이 다른 것 같은데 AMN 헬스케어 서비스 앞으로도 그런 움직임이 나타날 수 있을 것 같습니다. 더 좋은 움직임이 나타날 수 있을 거라고 보고 있고요. 그렇다면 AMN 헬스케어 서비스가 어느 곳에서 수익을 창출하는지도 궁금합니다. 그런 부분에 대해서도 설명 부탁드릴게요.
Okay, so let's think about this. Let's take COVID out of the situation. Let's go back and let's look at 2016 to 2019. And don't forget what we talked about, how the American model is changing a little bit in terms of going from a physician-owned practice to an employed practice by a healthcare group. In 2016, the dominant amount of revenue was generated by physician searches. Second to that was searches for nurses, and just below that was searches for specialists. Well, what we've seen between 2016 and 2019 is the searches for specialists doubled. The searches for nurses increased 50%, and the searches for physicians basically stayed the same, grew a little bit. So what's happened is now, relatively speaking, the contribution from the physicians and the nurses is becoming much greater. And I anticipate that to continue to grow. We want to look at the stock also, or we want to look at revenues and look at how it affects the stock prices. So we want to think about how in terms of, not only in terms of revenues, but in terms of stock prices, we want to think about how the stock performs. So I took AMN and I wanted to compare it relative to the stock market. So I used the NASDAQ index. And I took AMN and I divided it by the NASDAQ index. If that ratio goes higher, and this is a weekly chart, if that ratio goes higher over time, AMN is outperforming the NASDAQ index. If that ratio goes lower, the NASDAQ index is outperforming AMN. So we can see on this chart that there are 4 distinct periods over the last 4 years where AMN has outperformed the NASDAQ index. Then there's also 3 or 4 distinct periods where it's underperformed. If we want to look at those performance levels and compare those to the price performance of AMN at the time, okay, so the top chart is the 4, and I added one more because I went back 5 years. The 5 periods that AMN outperformed the NASDAQ index. The bottom part of that chart is what happened to AMN stock when it did. So what we can see here is that when AMN outperforms the NASDAQ index, it does a great job of performing, and it really outperforms the market, particularly after the completion of that COVID price decline. So I think this is important to think about when we think about a stock that outperforms the stock market as a whole.
네, 이 AMN 헬스케어 서비스가 지난 4년 동안 증가한 그런 성장세보다 최근에 1년 동안 성장했던 그 각도가 굉장히 가파른 모습을 보여줬습니다. 앞으로도 꾸준히 성장할 수 있다는 뜻이겠죠. 그리고 이 나스닥이 성장하는 만큼 이 AMN 헬스케어 서비스가 그 성장세를 뛰어넘는다면 정말 투자를 할 만한 그런 매력적인 종목이 되지 않을까 싶은데요. 그렇다면 마지막으로 AMN 헬스케어 서비스의 투자 포인트와 매매 전략까지 함께 세워주시죠.
AMN is a great setup right now in terms of demographics. We have a population that's aging, so the population base needs more medical services, and the amount of service providers, be they physicians or specialists or nurses, are all in acute shortage. So there's a high demand for those services on top of the fact that those services are really in demand. I think that setup is a beautiful setup to go forward. So I think we should expect to see continued demand and actually probably accelerating growth within this space for the next 10 years. So I'm a fan of this stock. I think the stock is a good stock, and I think it's an outstanding stock to buy on dips whenever there's setbacks, because of the compelling demographic story.